When we think of winter today, we might imagine cozy blankets, hot drinks, and glowing fireplaces. But let's set those warm, modern comforts aside for a moment and imagine something far colder, much darker, and thoroughly more unpleasant. Picture instead a long, bitter winter's night in the Middle Ages, a time before central heating, electric lights, or even a good understanding of insulation. In this slow and sleepy journey, we'll explore why the medieval winter night was not just uncomfortable, it was a test of survival, endurance, and in many cases, sheer boredom. As the sun vanished over the horizon, which happened surprisingly early in the day, the world plunged into darkness. And unlike today, when we simply flick a switch and bathe in light, the people of medieval Europe had very little to push back the night. The common person might have had a smoky tallow candle or two, or a crude oil lamp made from clay. But for the most part, the average peasant lived with the darkness. It seeped through the walls, settled into the corners, and made everything slow, quiet, and deeply, profoundly cold. The winter season in northern Europe could be brutal. Days were short, nights were long, and warmth was a rare luxury. Most people lived in small, damp, and poorly insulated dwellings. The houses, often made from wattle and daub or cold, bare stone, offered more protection from the wind than actual warmth. Roofs leaked, drafts slipped in through ill-fitted doors. The wind moaned constantly, pressing at the walls like some ancient spirit trying to get in. There was no escape from the cold, and night brought with it a peculiar kind of stillness that wasn't peaceful, just resigned. Peasants would gather what warmth they could during the day. If they were lucky, they might have a small fire burning in a central hearth, with smoke lazily drifting upward into the thatched roof, sometimes escaping through a small hole if the house had one. Chimneys weren't common in the earlier medieval period, so most of that smoke just settled in the rafters, blackening the beams and stinging the eyes of anyone trying to sit near the fire. Even the fire itself wasn't a guarantee. Wood was precious, especially in winter, and gathering enough to burn all night was a luxury most couldn't afford. As darkness fell, activity ceased. There was no nightlife, no evening social hour. People simply stopped. They retreated to their beds, or more accurately, the vague pile of cloth, straw, and animal skins that passed for bedding. Families often shared sleeping spaces, sometimes even beds, huddling together like livestock in a barn, which in some cases they literally were. It was not uncommon for animals to be brought inside to help keep the house warm. A pig, a few chickens, maybe a goat. They contributed their body heat, their smells, and their noises. Nothing says peaceful winter night like trying to sleep next to a gassy goat. Sleep was a slow surrender. There was little to do. Without light, reading was out of the question for the very few who could read at all. Storytelling might pass a little time, especially for children, but eventually, silence fell. The kind of silence you don't really hear anymore. The heavy, pressing silence of the pre-electric world. No hum of appliances, no streetlights, no cars, no distant television sets. Just wind, creaking wood, and perhaps the low muttering of someone praying to keep away evil spirits. Because yes, the medieval night was full of fear, not just discomfort. Night was the realm of ghosts, demons, and witches. People genuinely believed the darkness held dangers, both real and imagined. It wasn't safe to go outside. It wasn't even necessarily safe inside. There were stories of things that crept through cracks, slipped down chimneys, or crouched at the foot of your bed. And the church only amplified this fear, warning of sinful thoughts, unholy temptations, and spiritual dangers that came with idleness and darkness. For children, it must have been terrifying. For adults, it was a time of deep fatigue and often hopelessness. Winter meant scarcity of food, of light, of warmth. The nights dragged on endlessly, and there was little to mark the passing of time. Hours crawled. There were no clocks. Of course, time was felt, not measured, and the cold made every minute feel like 3. Your only marker was perhaps the burning down of a candle, or the changing sound of wind through the thatch. And yet, night was not entirely sleep. As we'll explore in the next section, people didn't just close their eyes and sleep 8 hours straight. Medieval sleep patterns were strange and broken, a reflection of how hard it was to stay asleep in such cold and discomfort. But before we get to that, take a moment to imagine this. lying on a scratchy wool sheet, wrapped in a coarse blanket. In a pitch-black room filled with coughs, snores, and the occasional squeal of a piglet shifting in the straw. Your toes are numb, your back is sore, and there are still 10 hours until the sun returns. This was the beginning of every winter night in the Middle Ages. And it only got worse from here. Imagine preparing for bed just after lunch. That's what winter often felt like in the Middle Ages. In many parts of Europe, particularly in the northern regions, the sun would begin its descent by mid-afternoon. By the time peasants had finished a modest meal, if they were lucky enough to have one, the sky was already dimming, painted in dull grease and fading quickly into night. This wasn't a gentle twilight filled with golden light and long shadows. It was more like the world pulling a cold wool blanket over its head, and telling everyone to stop what they were doing. There were no clocks on the wall, no apps telling people when to light candles. Time was observed in a far more practical way. When the sun dipped behind the hills, and your hands could no longer distinguish one object from another, you stopped working. A medieval saying went something like this: when your shadow is longer than your height, it's time to be home. And in winter, that happened shockingly early, sometimes as early as 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This abrupt end to the day wasn't just an inconvenience, it reshaped every aspect of life. Tasks had to be compressed into narrow windows of usable light. Farming was already near impossible in the frozen ground, but even indoor work, like spinning, weaving, and mending tools, had to be done hastily. A single candle barely helped. The rush to beat the dark was real and constant. Once darkness settled in, most people didn't do much. They simply couldn't. Candlelight, contrary to what romantic scenes in movies may suggest, was not a common luxury. Candles were made from tallow, rendered animal fat, and smelled about as pleasant as you'd expect. They also sputtered and smoked and burned down quickly. Beeswax candles, which actually gave off a cleaner, steadier light, were mostly reserved for the church and wealthy households. So for the vast majority, the early sunset meant the beginning of a long, poorly lit, and dreary night. One candle might be hoarded and only lit for crucial tasks, like tending to an injury or delivering a baby. Reading or writing by candlelight wasn't even a consideration for most. Not because it was too romantic, but because they didn't have books, or the ability to read them. Supper, the evening meal, was typically consumed as the light failed. It was a simple affair, likely cold and mostly the same as every other night. Perhaps some bread, cheese if it hadn't gone moldy, and something boiled, always boiled, in the pot over the hearth. Root vegetables like turnips or parsnips, maybe dried peas. Occasionally, bits of salted meat. And that's if the harvest had been decent. In a poor winter, even these staples were hard to come by. No one was eating at a table set with candles and laughter. Most peasants sat on wooden stools, or directly on the packed earth floor. Plates, if they existed at all, were often just slabs of coarse bread used as makeshift trenchers. The meal was more of a necessary act than a social ritual, eaten quickly before the last natural light disappeared. Once it did, the world transformed into a dim, creaking, breathing presence, a living thing made of shadows and drafts. And that's where people stayed, indoors, in the growing dark, waiting. The contrast between the energetic scramble of the short winter day and the suffocating stillness of the long night was stark. Day was labor, movement, sound. Night was quiet, stillness, and survival. The drop in temperature that came with the setting sun was swift and severe. Whatever warmth had been captured during the daylight hours vanished almost instantly. The hearth fire might continue to burn, but often at half strength. For those living in the countryside, and outside, most people, the frost darkness wasn't just indoors. It blanketed entire villages. No street lamps, no distant porch lights, no glowing windows. Maybe the occasional flicker of a lantern if someone dared venture outside. But mostly, it was pure blackness, the kind that blots out even your hand in front of your face. This wasn't the soft night of moonlight and stars. Clouds were common in winter. The moon came and went. Often, it was just dark, oppressing, muffled dark that made the world feel impossibly still. And so, the evening hours were often passed in silence. Families might sit together on a bench, near the embers of the hearth, not speaking much. What was there to say? The day's labor was done. There was no news, no reading, no games, unless you had a carved piece of bone or a ball of cloth. But even then, it was hard to see. Some would pray, long, whispered prayers muttered toward the low beams of the ceiling. Prayer wasn't just a religious act. It was something to do, a way to pass the hours. Others simply rested, not necessarily sleeping, just lying down, listening to the wind rattle the wooden door, or whistle through the thatch above. Conversations, if they happened, were quiet and brief. The human voice felt too loud in a night that thick. Even loud breathing might draw a shh from someone nearby. Noise felt risky. For children, the early night must have seemed endless. There was little concept of time, in the way we understand it now. Without sunlight, each hour dragged on like an eternity. When would it end? When would morning come? Even adults had no real way of knowing. They simply waited, and often woke up multiple times in the middle of the night, unsure whether it was closer to dawn or still the dead of night. There was something mournful about it. The way the darkness swallowed everything. The way life itself paused. It was not peaceful. Not like the stillness of a modern winter night warmed by central heating and the hum of electronics. This was a different stillness, a forced surrender to nature. The outside world was inaccessible. The inside world was barely tolerable. And yet, this was the rhythm of life, accepted without complaint because there was no alternative. The sun disappeared before supper, and took with it comfort, safety, and clarity. What remained was a long, colorless stretch of hours filled with cold, hunger, superstition, and silence. A vacuum of activity, where people simply existed quietly, waiting for the light to return. If you've ever lived in a house with poor insulation, you'll know a little of the creeping, bone-deep chill that seems to settle into the very structure of a building. Now imagine that sensation, only much, much worse. That was winter in the Middle Ages. Not just the kind of cold that made you shiver, but the kind that felt like it had a personality. The kind of cold that wasn't just in the air, it was in the walls, the floor, your clothes, your bones, your breath. And worst of all, it didn't leave. Medieval houses, especially for the common people, were not built with comfort in mind. They were built with whatever materials were available locally: rough stones, wooden beams, mud, straw, thatch. These materials provided shelter from the elements, but they offered very little in the way of warmth. Stone, in particular, had a way of absorbing the cold during long winter nights, and radiating it right back at the people huddled inside. If you've ever touched a stone wall on a winter morning, you'll know it doesn't just feel cold, it feels like it's storing a small glacier inside. Multiply that by an entire room made of stone, and you begin to understand the experience of a medieval night. There was no insulation, no foam lining hidden behind drywall, no double-glazed windows or sealed door frames, just thick, cold walls and cracks that welcomed the outside air. And that outside air was often bitter. In many parts of medieval Europe, winter temperatures would drop well below freezing. Wind would whip through the countryside, finding every hole in the thatch roof or gap between wall planks. The homes were drafty. You didn't need to step outside to feel the winter. It came to you. It seeped in through the door and the floor, curled around your toes, and made itself at home. The hearth fire was the center of the house, not just physically, but in terms of survival. It was often the only source of heat. But that heat didn't go far. It warmed a small area around the hearth, perhaps enough to take the edge off the air. But in a room with stone walls and no insulation, the warmth vanished quickly into the chill. People sitting farther from the fire might as well have been outdoors. And you couldn't just keep the fire roaring all night. Firewood was scarce and precious. Forests were heavily managed or owned by lords, and gathering wood without permission could lead to harsh punishment. Peasants had to make do with what they could collect legally, often fallen branches, twigs, or peat. Fires were small, controlled, and carefully maintained. They weren't meant to heat a room, just to cook food, dry clothes, and stave off hypothermia. When the fire died down for the night, and it nearly always did, the cold took over completely. Stone floors became as unforgiving as ice. Blankets couldn't compete. Even the act of breathing created small clouds of vapor in the air. Your nose ran, your fingers numbed, and there was no getting warm again until sunrise, if then. Even more luxurious medieval homes, with their thicker stone walls and higher ceilings, faced the same problem. The cold lingered. Castles, for all their grandeur, were notoriously frigid. Large rooms took forever to warm up, and often never really did. Tapestries were hung not just for decoration, but to try to trap a bit of warmth or at least block drafts. Rushes were scattered on the floors, partly to provide a thin barrier from the chill of the stone. It helped, slightly, but not enough. Sleeping arrangements made things a bit better, but only just. People layered everything they could find: rough wool blankets, cloaks, animal hides. They shared beds, not out of affection, but out of necessity. Shared body heat was the most reliable form of warmth available. Families often crowded together, all in one bed or on a shared sleeping platform. The idea of personal space didn't exist. Comfort was less important than not freezing to death. And still, people woke in the night from the cold. Blankets slipped off, feet poked out, the wind shifted. A hole in the thatch let in a cold drip of snowmelt onto someone's cheek. There was no such thing as deep, restful sleep. Most sleep was broken, filled with tossing and turning, coughing, and a kind of half-dreaming shiver that became normal over time. The cold didn't just make people uncomfortable, it made them sick. Constant exposure to freezing temperatures wore down the immune system. Colds, flus, and respiratory infections flourished. With no knowledge of germs and little understanding of sanitation, illnesses spread easily. And once someone got sick, their chances of recovery were slim in such conditions. There were no warm beds, no hot soup, no central heating, just more stone walls, more cold, and a bit of hope that the fever would break before the morning came. In some houses, tents were made to insulate. Gaps might be stuffed with straw, cloth, or moss. Animal skins might be nailed over openings. In desperate times, people even burned furniture to stay warm. But these were last-ditch efforts, and they rarely worked for long. The cold always returned. It was part of the house. A guest who had moved in and refused to leave. This cold-shaped behavior, it dictated everything from bedtime to clothing, to how people gathered. No one sat alone, not because they feared loneliness, but because they feared freezing. People clustered. They layered clothes without removing them for days. They huddled under shared covers. Children slept next to parents, animals next to children, neighbors next to neighbors if needed. Warmth was social. Warmth was survival. And so the medieval night passed in a kind of half-sleep, a half-shiver, as the stone walls held on tightly to their frost. They didn't forget the cold. They stored it. Even in spring, the walls could stay chilly, exhaling their long-held winter breath. In the middle of January, they were like slabs of winter itself, silent, unmoving, and merciless. If you lived in a stone house in the Middle Ages, you didn't just fear the weather outside. You feared the walls around you, because they remembered every winter they had ever known. Peasants and they would never have one. The idea of a frame with a mattress was a luxury. Many stone walls had released all their icy dirt or rough wooden surface. You'd have only one line of defense, covered with a thin mat made of woven straw, of the medieval winter night, or dried rushes. If you're picturing quickly, it invited insects, flannel sheets, poked you in the back, or even a modest, smelled faintly of livestock. Adjust your expectations, sleep on something raised off the floor. Now imagine an itchy sack full of old straw or bench, a stiff woolen sheet shared by maybe a half-torn animal hide. What did they sleep in line with the medieval experience? Anything and everything. A medieval blanket was more of a category than an object. The most common material was coarse wool, not the kind you knit sweaters with today, but a thick, scratchy, unrefined wool that was barely processed. It kept in heat, yes, but it also trapped filth, moisture, and fleas. And it was heavy. Very heavy. One blanket might weigh nearly as much as a child. Imagine trying to roll over with a damp, itchy cloak of lead pinning you to your straw bed. If you lived in poverty, which, for most people, was not a phase but a permanent condition, you might not even have that. Instead, you'd use whatever scraps were available: old clothing, torn cloaks, pieces of canvas, discarded sacks, a badly cured sheepskin, still slightly oily and faintly smelling of mutton. The idea was not to be comfortable, but simply not to freeze. People layered what they had: rags, cloaks, animal pelts, maybe an old curtain if the Lord had recently thrown one out. In wealthier households, bedding was a little more refined, though still rough by modern standards. They might have sheets, made of linen, if they were lucky, an actual quilt stuffed with wool or down, but these were incredibly expensive. Down, in particular, had to be hand-plucked from geese and ducks, and was time-consuming to gather. Even in castles, Fine bedding was a marker of wealth. The lord and lady might have thick feather beds, layered furs, and decorative quilts. Servants, however, slept on pallets near the fire, or not near it at all, with barely a blanket between them and the freezing night. Washing these blankets was not a regular event. In fact, it was rare. Wool doesn't wash easily, especially with medieval soap, a mixture of lye and animal fat, which was harsh and damaging. Most bedding was aired out occasionally, beaten with sticks, or sprinkled with herbs to mask the smell. But over time, the accumulation of sweat, dirt, animal hair, and whatever was crawling inside it made blankets as much of a hazard as a comfort. Blankets were also homes, not just for people, but for fleas, lice, and mites. These tiny pests thrived in the warm, dark folds of bedding. They came out at night, bit exposed skin, and laid eggs in seams and fibers. And they were nearly impossible to get rid of. Even regular boiling or baking the blankets in the sun, common remedies of the time, offered only temporary relief. You could go to bed cold and itchy, and wake up cold and itchier. Another curious element of medieval bedding was the bedfellow. Because warmth was so precious, people often shared beds, not just with family members, but with servants, apprentices, even guests. In inns, strangers might be assigned the same bed if space was limited. And no, this wasn't an inn with fresh sheets and room service. It was more likely a wooden frame, with a lice-ridden sack of straw on top, barely separated from the rest of the room. You'd lie side by side, under a shared blanket, trying not to shiver too loudly, or steal all the covers, for it was highly valued in colder regions. Fox, rabbit, bear, and even dog pelts were sewn together to create makeshift covers. These helped, at least in terms of warmth, but came with their own problems. They attracted moths and mold. They had to be cured properly or they'd rot. And again, the smell was memorable. If you were fortunate, the fur was soft and intact. If not, you might spend the night clinging to a stiff patch of hide with patches of fur missing, wondering which part of the animal you were sleeping under. Children often received the worst of it. In a large family, the youngest were bundled together under whatever was left after the adults had taken the best layers. They might sleep in corners, near the door, or even in the loft with the animals. Parents assumed body heat would keep the children warm enough, and sometimes it did. Other times, they got sick. Cold nights contributed to high infant mortality rates, respiratory infections, and slow, aching misery that left people weakened for life. Even the concept of comfort in sleep was alien to many medieval minds. You didn't lie in bed for pleasure. You lay down because your body couldn't stand anymore, and you needed to survive the night. Dreams were considered suspicious, a place where demons might visit, or sinful thoughts might emerge. Night was not restful, it was dangerous. And blankets, such as they were your only line of defense against both physical and spiritual invasion. And so the medieval person lay in their bed, if they had one, beneath a stack of stiff, damp, crawling, patched together fabrics. Every time they moved, they risked losing precious body heat. Every shift revealed a new cold patch. Every night, the blankets became a battle, not for comfort, but simply to make it until morning. You weren't covered in warmth, you were buried in desperation. If you were lucky, your blanket didn't smell too bad. If you were truly fortunate, it didn't bite you. But one thing was guaranteed. It didn't stop the cold from finding you eventually. The medieval night always won. And no matter how many layers you had, there was always a sharp draft waiting for you underneath it all. The fire was everything. In a medieval winter night, it was not just warmth, it was life. It was your stove, your heater, your source of light, your protector against the dark, and in a way, your therapist. A crackling hearth fire was the only thing standing between you and the full, brutal indifference of nature. But for all its importance, the fire was also deeply unreliable, and more often than not, it simply didn't last the night. To begin with, firewood wasn't just lying around waiting to be burned. Forests were not free-for-alls. In much of medieval Europe, woodland was controlled by local lords or the crown. The trees belonged to someone else, and cutting them down without permission was considered theft, punishable by fines, flogging, or worse. What common people could collect legally was usually limited to deadfall, twigs, branches, bits of bark, and other scraps already lying on the ground. This was barely enough to build a decent blaze, let alone sustain one for hours on end. What's more, collecting wood was physically punishing and time-consuming. It meant trekking through the cold, often with numb fingers and bare legs, dragging bundles of wet sticks on your back. Children did it. Elders did it. Women did it, sometimes with infants strapped to them. And once you brought it home, you had to dry it out, often by leaving it near the hearth for days, which took up space and smelled vaguely of mushrooms and rot. When wood ran low, people burned anything flammable: dried animal dung, peat bricks cut from bogs, straw, brush, old thatch, even shoes, furniture, and doors if things got bad enough. These substitutes burned quickly, gave off little heat, and produced thick, choking smoke. But they were better than nothing, barely. So even if you had a fire, you couldn't keep it blazing. The goal was conservation. Fires were built small, tended sparingly, and used for cooking first. If there was a bit of warmth left after dinner, that was a bonus. But come nightfall, the fire would usually be banked, a process where ashes were shoveled over glowing embers to smother the flame while keeping the core just alive enough to restart it in the morning. But this method was temperamental. One bad bank job, one unexpected draft, and you'd wake up to a cold pile of dead gray ash. There was no flint and steel convenience, no matches, no lighters. Starting a new fire from scratch took time and effort. It meant flint and tinder, or rubbing sticks, or stealing embers from a neighbor. People guarded their embers like treasure. A well-tended hearth wasn't just household pride, it was household survival. But even when the fire was strong, the warmth didn't travel. Most medieval homes, particularly among the peasantry, had no chimney. Instead, smoke was allowed to drift through a hole in the roof, or simply billow out into the room until it found its own way out. This meant the hearth was central not only in importance but in literal placement, smack in the middle of the floor. Everything revolved around it. And still, it didn't warm the entire house. The fire's heat extended a few feet outward. After that, the cold took over. Sleeping near the fire was a privilege. Children, the elderly, or the sick might be placed closest. Servants and laborers got the outer zones. Sometimes animals, too, goats, pigs, even chickens, were brought inside to share body heat and take advantage of whatever warmth the fire offered. It wasn't cozy, it was cramped, smoky, and pungent. But the alternative was worse. At night, the fire slowly faded. No one dared leave it unattended, and roaring, too dangerous. In wooden homes with straw roofs, fire was both savior and threat, so it was allowed to dim. Families curled up early, knowing that the room would steadily grow colder, and by midnight, the fire would be down to embers or gone entirely. The room might be completely dark by then, lit only by moonlight leaking through cracks in the wall, and even that assumed a clear sky. Once the fire went out, there was nothing to do but wait for dawn. Relighting it in the middle of the night was risky. Stirring the ashes made noise. It woke others. It drew attention. It used up precious fuel that might be needed for cooking the next day's meal. So you stayed under your questionable blankets, your nose freezing, your feet curled against your own thighs or another person's shins, praying you'd fall asleep before the shivering got too loud to ignore. The psychological toll of a dead fire was real. It signaled the loss of the one truly living thing in the room. A fire crackles. It glows. It moves. It speaks in its own language. When it goes silent, the room becomes dead space. Shadows stretch longer. Every sound outside, the creak of a tree, the howl of wind, the shuffle of a rodent, feels louder. You become aware of every breath, every drip of melting frost, every tick of the cooling roof beams. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was total. And yet, this was routine. No one expected the fire to last the night. They didn't have the fuel, the safety, or the architecture. This made mornings a trial. You didn't rise refreshed. You rose out of necessity. The first one up had to stir the ashes, nurse the coals, and try to bring flame back to life. Fingers shaking, teeth chattering, breath fogging the air. That was how every day began. No coffee, no slippers, no central heating, just flint and hope. In wealthier homes, the situation was slightly better. Some castles had early chimneys by the 12th or 13th century, primitive structures that funneled smoke through stone channels in the wall. These allowed for larger fires and warmer chambers for the nobility. But even castles were cold. The heat didn't rise efficiently. Most of the castle remained freezing. Lords and ladies wrapped themselves in furs and velvet, sat close to huge hearths, and still complained of drafts. Even monasteries, where silence, discipline, and structure reigned, had to bend to the cold. Monks gathered in a single heated chamber, called the warming room, where one fire was maintained for communal use. But the dormitories, ice-rimmed, the cloisters, frozen, the cell where you slept alone with God, absolutely frigid. So the fire, once gone, left a void, a chilling emptiness that was never really filled. Night swallowed everything, and you were left with your body heat, your layered rags, and your prayers. Maybe tomorrow you'd have enough wood for a stronger blaze. Maybe not. Either way, you knew the same thing. Every medieval person knew. The fire went out anyway. Always. And when it did, the long, hard night truly began. If you're imagining medieval people slipping into soft, comfortable pajamas before bedtime, you're thinking in modern terms. And you're wrong. Very wrong. The truth is far less glamorous, and far colder. Nighttime clothing in the Middle Ages wasn't a special set of garments. It was whatever you'd been wearing all day, only now layered with a little extra hope and endurance. For the vast majority of people, peasants, servants, tradesfolk, there simply wasn't a separate wardrobe for sleeping. Clothes were expensive, time-consuming to make, and precious. You didn't own many sets. Instead, you wore your working clothes from dawn until dusk, and then into the night. And if it was winter, that meant multiple layers of rough, heavy wool, linen, and sometimes even animal pelts, often patched, faded, and smelling of sweat and smoke. Wool was the main material because it was warm, water-resistant, and widely available, but it was scratchy, coarse, and irritating against the skin. Underneath, people wore linen shirts or shifts, but these were often thin and worn through in places. Clothes were patched repeatedly, sometimes with fabric of different colors or textures, sewn on with rough stitches that could snag or irritate. Buttons were rare or non-existent. Ties and pins were used instead. The overall effect was less fashion and more functional survival. At the end of a cold winter day, people were tired, dirty, and cold. Bathing was a luxury, if it happened at all, and clothes went unwashed for long stretches. Wearing the same clothes to bed as during the day wasn't just a convenience, it was a necessity. Removing layers meant exposing yourself to the biting cold, and having no guarantee of being able to warm up again. So many layered themselves heavily, keeping every piece on. This had obvious downsides. The clothes you wore all day carried dust, sweat, grease from cooking, animal odors, and whatever grime had settled from the streets or fields. They were also crawling with insects. Lice in particular were a constant plague. These tiny parasites thrived in the folds of fabric, in the hair, and along the seams of clothing. Nighttime didn't offer relief. If anything, the darkness and warmth of a body trapped in heavy layers made lice more active and harder to detect. Because of this, itching and discomfort were constant companions at night. People would often wake up scratching, flinching, or rubbing sore skin raw. Yet, there was little they could do. Removing clothes meant losing precious warmth, and washing or replacing them wasn't easy or frequent. Clothing was repaired or patched, but rarely replaced entirely. In addition, the same clothes worn for long hours outside were often damp from snow, rain, or sweat. Damp clothes against skin on cold winter nights created a perfect storm of misery. Instead of insulating, they pulled heat away from the body. Wet wool is heavy and cold. It can be more dangerous than no covering at all. Yet, drying clothes indoors was difficult. Fireplaces were small, and indoor space limited. Clothes hung near the hearth might dry slowly, but that warmth was limited and fleeting. The result? People often went to bed cold, itchy, and damp, with no option to change. The ritual of undressing for bed, familiar to us today, simply didn't exist for most medieval folk. Instead, they layered on an additional cloak, wrapped themselves in blankets or furs, and hoped for the best. Among the wealthier classes, there were exceptions. Nobles and royalty did own dedicated night garments, often finely made linen shirts or shifts that were more comfortable than daily wear. These were prized possessions, laundered and cared for carefully. But even for them, sleeping arrangements were cold and drafty, and clothes alone could not guarantee warmth. The monks and nuns of religious orders, who valued simplicity and austerity, also often slept in their day robes, or simple woolen habits. Their strict rules about possessions and cleanliness meant they accepted discomfort as a form of spiritual discipline. These robes were heavy and coarse, not designed for comfort or warmth, but for modesty and obedience. The hygiene aspect is important too. Medieval people bathed infrequently, and laundering was infrequent and arduous. Dirt, sweat, and lice accumulated. Wearing day clothes to bed meant carrying all of that in with you through the night. The bedding, if there was any, added to the problem, as blankets and sheets were seldom cleaned regularly. The combination of worn, damp, and insect-infested clothing, combined with thin, threadbare bedding, and freezing stone walls, created a perfect storm for an uncomfortable night. Sleep was often restless and broken, punctuated by cold, itching, and discomfort. People rose at dawn stiff, sore, and still cold. All this may sound bleak, and it was. But medieval people adapted to these conditions because they had no choice. They made do with what they had, layering clothes and blankets, huddling close together, and enduring the discomfort. Their survival depended on accepting that night was a long, cold, itchy battle, and clothing was part of the battlefield. So, next time you slip into your cozy pajamas, remember, medieval nights were fought in patched wool, soaked linen, and layers of grime. There were no soft silks, no gentle cottons, no warm fleece, just the same heavy, scratchy clothes you'd worn all day, now your only shield against the unforgiving medieval winter night. When we think about sleep today, we usually picture a single, uninterrupted stretch of 8 hours or so, a solid block of rest that carries us through the night. But in medieval times, especially during those long, freezing winter nights, sleep was not one continuous nap. Instead, it was segmented, broken into 2 or more distinct periods, with a waking phase in between. This pattern, called segmented sleep, or bimodal sleep, was common throughout pre-industrial Europe and shaped how people lived, worked, and even thought about the night. The cycle went something like this. People would fall asleep shortly after the sun went down, usually around 7 or 8 p.m. They would sleep for several hours, typically 4 or 5, and then wake up in the middle of the night, sometime around midnight or 1 a.m. This waking period wasn't brief or restless. It could last anywhere from 30 minutes to a few hours. After this interval, they would go back to sleep until dawn. But what did they do during this waking period? The answer depends on where you lived and your social status. But it was often a time of quiet reflection, prayer, socializing, or even work. With no electric lights to keep them busy, people adapted to the darkness and cold in various ways. One common practice was to use this time for prayer and meditation. Medieval Christianity taught that the night was a spiritual battleground, a time when evil forces were active. Waking in the middle of the night was seen as an opportunity to pray and protect oneself from demonic influences. Monks and nuns, in particular, used this time for vigils, long sessions of prayer and chanting, often sitting quietly or walking in cloisters. For lay people, the waking hours might be spent in hushed conversation with family or neighbors, telling stories, sharing news, or planning the next day's work. Some used the time for household chores that could be done quietly, such as mending clothes, preparing simple meals, or tending to animals indoors. Others simply sat by the dying embers of the fire, watching the flickering shadows, lost in thought or worry. Because the nights were so cold, many people stayed bundled up in bed during this waking period. They might get up to add a bit of wood to the hearth if they had fuel, but often they just endured the chill until dawn. Without artificial light, activities were limited. Candles were expensive and reserved for special occasions, so darkness was respected, and people adapted their lives accordingly. This pattern of segmented sleep wasn't seen as problematic or unusual. In fact, historical documents and literature suggest that it was considered normal and natural. People describe the first sleep and second sleep as distinct phases, each with its own character. The first sleep was deep and restorative. The second was lighter and often associated with dreams, nightmares, or prophetic visions. Interestingly, this segmented sleep model may also explain the origins of many cultural traditions and folklore related to the night. The witching hour, for example, is thought to correspond to this middle waking period, when people were most vulnerable to supernatural forces. Midnight meetings, ghost stories, and tales of night spirits often take place in these hours. But segmented sleep was not without drawbacks. The cold night made falling back asleep difficult, especially if the fire had died down and blankets were thin or damp. Waking in the dark with nothing to do could stir anxiety, loneliness, or fear. The mind, freed from the fog of sleep, could ruminate on troubles or imagine threats. Many people reported restless nights punctuated by frequent waking and difficulty returning to slumber. In addition, the physical discomfort of the cold, scratchy bedding and day clothes we discussed earlier only added to the struggle. When your body is stiff, your skin itchy, and your feet numb, lying awake in the freezing dark is a torture of patience. Despite these hardships, segmented sleep was a pragmatic adaptation to the environment and technology of the time. Without artificial lighting, without central heating, and without modern bedding, people lived their nights in phases, sleeping deeply when they could, waking to tend to their needs or their souls, and then sleeping again. It wasn't until the widespread adoption of artificial lighting, gas lamps, candles, and later electric bulbs, that the concept of continuous, 8-hour sleep became common. The bright, steady illumination extended the day, pushing back bedtime and changing natural rhythms. By the Industrial Revolution, segmented sleep was largely replaced by consolidated sleep as we know it. But for medieval people, those cold winter nights were long, dark, and divided. Sleep came in stages, not just a simple, cozy escape, but a fragmented experience shaped by the harshness of their environment and the limits of their technology. So if you ever find yourself waking up in the middle of the night, unable to fall back asleep, just remember, you're following a tradition as old as winter itself. And in the Middle Ages, that waking time was filled not with frustration, but with quiet reflection, or sometimes, just waiting for the cold to pass. When you lay down for the night in a medieval home, if you were lucky enough to have a bed at all, you didn't sleep alone. You had company, not just a spouse, or children, or perhaps the family goat. You were also joined by a scurrying, biting, crawling army of vermin that turned every night into a shared nightmare. Let's begin with the rats. Medieval homes, especially peasant cottages, were far from sealed environments. The walls were made of wattle and daub, a kind of plastered mud over woven sticks. The roofs were thatched straw. The floors, dirt. Gaps were everywhere. Holes in walls, cracks in beams, spaces between roof and wall, all of them perfect for little whiskered intruders. Rats came in search of warmth, food, and nesting material. And in winter, human homes offered all three. Rats were bold. They crept across rafters. They nested in straw mattresses. They chewed through stores of grain and gnawed at wooden bed frames. Some were so used to human presence, they would run across sleeping bodies at night. People would hear them in the darkness, the clicking of claws, the scuffle of movement behind the walls, or the sudden rustle at the foot of the bed. In some cases, people slept with sticks or clubs within reach, not to fend off thieves, but to smack at the rats they heard beneath the covers. And then there were the fleas. Fleas were simply a fact of life. They lived in bedding, in hair, in clothing, and in the straw-stuffed mattresses that made up most sleeping arrangements. Beds were rare for poor households. Most people slept on piles of straw, old rags, or shared platforms made of wood and animal skins. The straw was rarely changed. It was flattened, matted, damp, and teeming with life, not just fleas, but mites, beetles, and lice. Fleas didn't just cause discomfort, they spread disease. They were one of the main carriers of the bubonic plague, a fact unknown to medieval people. But even without plague, their presence was torment. The constant itch, the biting, the small red welts, these were normal bedtime experiences. Children scratched themselves bloody. Adults grew accustomed to twitching in their sleep. To live in the Middle Ages was to be constantly irritated, in every sense of the word. Bedding, if you had any, made things worse. Mattresses were sacks stuffed with straw, feathers, or hay. Over time, these contents broke down, creating a perfect warm nest for insects. Bedbugs were common and voracious, feeding at night and retreating during the day. Lice, meanwhile, lived in seams of clothing and bedding, feeding on human blood and laying eggs in clusters. Delizing was a routine, often done with combs, fingers, or by holding clothes near fire to kill the crawling menace. But they always came back. If you were wealthy, things were only marginally better. Nobles had large wooden beds with frames and canopies, not for privacy, but to hang heavy curtains. These curtains helped trap warmth, but also trapped fleas and lice. Feather beds, considered luxurious, were more comfortable and more absorbent. They soaked up sweat, grease, and body oil, turning them into soft, expensive breeding grounds for parasites. Silk sheets didn't repel bugs. They just made it more frustrating when you discovered them anyway. Medieval people were not unaware of their problems. They scratched. They picked at their scalps and their skin. They had folk remedies and religious prayers against vermin. Some people slept with herbs tucked into bedding, lavender, pennyroyal, tansy, to repel fleas. Others burned strong-smelling plants, hoping the smoke would drive out insects. But in winter, with windows sealed and fires smoldering low, fresh air was rare. The bugs stayed. Nighttime was also when vermin were most active. Rats and mice are nocturnal. Fleas feed at night. Bedbugs crawl toward heat, your heat. You were essentially a buffet laid out in layers of cloth and wool. And there was little escape. Getting up meant entering the freezing dark. Staying put meant enduring the crawl of insects, under your shirt and across your legs. Even pets weren't helpful. Cats might kill mice and rats, but they also brought fleas of their own. Dogs, often allowed to sleep indoors, carried lice, ticks, and dirt. And don't forget, in many homes, livestock were housed in the same space. Chickens roosted near sleeping children. Pigs grunted under the bed frame. Cows, goats, or donkeys might be just on the other side of a thin partition. With them came flies, mites, and every unpleasant smell imaginable. One might imagine that people got used to it, and in a way, they did. But used to it doesn't mean it didn't bother them. Medieval texts, letters, and household manuals all mention the problem of vermin. Monks wrote about the challenge of maintaining clean bedding. Doctors noted that lice and fleas caused itching, sores, and sometimes infections. It was understood that a clean body and fresh bedding helped, but the means to maintain those were rare, especially in winter. Because washing bedding was nearly impossible during the cold months. Water froze. Soap was scarce. Drying linens outdoors took days, and risked theft or weather damage. So most families simply endured. They might shake out their straw, sweep the floor, hang clothes near the fire, but the bugs always came back. And so, sleep was not peaceful. It was full of interruptions. People stirred, scratched, swatted, and sighed. They turned over, trying to find a less infested patch. Children cried in the night. Adults groaned. The idea of burrowing into a cozy, clean bed was fantasy. The medieval bed was a battleground, your body the battlefield, your skin under constant siege. There's a reason the word, bedfellows, has such an ominous historical ring. In the Middle Ages, you truly never slept alone. There were always others, scuttling, crawling, biting others, sharing your warmth, your food crumbs, your body. It was cold. It was itchy. It was unpleasant in ways modern people can scarcely imagine. So next time you curl up in your bug-free bed, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. They didn't sleep so much as endure the night, lying still, wrapped in damp wool, hoping the rats stayed in the rafters, and the fleas were too full to bite again. It's the middle of a pitch-black winter night. You've just woken up from your first sleep. Your fire has gone out. The temperature in your room is hovering just above freezing. You're huddled under layers of itchy, lice-ridden wool, trying not to breathe too hard because you can see your breath hanging in the air. And then, it hits you, the uncomfortable fullness in your bladder. You need to go. Now, in the 21st century, this would be a mild inconvenience. You'd throw back the covers, shuffle to the bathroom, flip on a light, and be back under the covers in minutes. In medieval Europe, however, going to the bathroom in the middle of the night was a vastly different affair, a full-blown cold-weather expedition, fraught with discomfort and peril. First of all, there was no indoor plumbing. The idea of a warm, tiled bathroom with running water and a door you can close was as fantastical to medieval people as flying cars are to us today. If you lived in a typical peasant cottage, a small, drafty structure with a single room, no glass windows, and a thatched roof, your toilet was not just outside, but often a considerable walk away. Medieval latrines came in several forms, none of them pleasant. The most basic was a simple pit dug in the ground, usually located at the edge of a property, or downwind of the house to keep the smell at bay. In some cases, there might be a wooden seat built over the hole, if you were lucky. Often, it was just squatting behind a tree or in a corner of the garden. In towns and cities, public latrines sometimes existed, but using them at night required walking through narrow, unlit streets crawling with rats, thieves, or worse. But remember, this is winter. Going outside meant facing the brutal cold, snowdrifts, and icy winds in the middle of the night. Most people slept in multiple layers, but stripping off enough to squat in the snow was a deeply unpleasant experience. The ground was hard, your fingers numb, and any exposed skin instantly chilled. You had to fumble with ties or belts in the dark, and hope you didn't drop anything essential in the snow. If you were lucky, or wealthy, you might have had a chamber pot. A chamber pot was essentially a small bowl, or bucket kept near the bed for nighttime emergencies. It allowed people to relieve themselves indoors without venturing into the freezing dark. But these came with their own set of issues. First, they weren't common in poor households, as even a basic ceramic vessel cost money. Second, they needed to be emptied, which meant someone, usually in the morning, had the nasty job of carrying the pot out and dumping it, often into the same latrine pit, or, more frequently, into the street. Yes, the street. In towns and villages, it was common practice to throw waste into open gutters or ditches that ran along the roads. This led to streets full of filth, even in winter. And if the contents of the chamber pot froze overnight, you'd wake up to the delightful task of chipping frozen urine out of a bucket. Charming. For those without chamber pots, it was all about braving the elements. In rural areas, people sometimes used the animal stall or the stable as an emergency bathroom during the night. At least it offered some cover and warmth, but that meant stepping over straw, droppings, and sleeping livestock in the pitch dark, while trying not to startle anything bigger than you. Monasteries and castles had their own solutions, but they weren't much more comfortable. In castles, garderobes were stone seats built into the castle wall, essentially medieval toilets that dropped waste down a chute into the moat or open pit below. If you needed to use one in the middle of the night, you had to walk through cold corridors, descend damp stairwells, and sit with your bare bottom over a freezing stone hole with the draft blowing up from the depths. Monasteries had communal latrines, often attached to the dormitory. Monks, living in rigid discipline, might use them at appointed times only. Nighttime trips were discouraged or carried out silently, with candles or lanterns. But these communal bathrooms were just rows of seats above a pit, open, cold, and shared with dozens of others. The discomfort of needing the bathroom at night extended beyond physical cold. There were also fears. The dark was full of unknowns, both real and imagined. Superstition ran deep, and many believed that evil spirits or demons roamed at night, especially in lonely or liminal places like latrines and crossroads. The phrase, "to go out into the night," had ominous undertones. Children were told stories of shadowy creatures that might snatch them if they wandered too far after dark. Some tried to avoid this nightly ordeal altogether by restricting food and drink before bed, but that only worked so well. Human nature and digestion have their own schedule, and no one, not even a medieval peasant, could always avoid that late-night urge. And let's not forget, menstruation, diarrhea, pregnancy, or illness all made nighttime trips more frequent and more difficult. There was no sanitary infrastructure to support any of these conditions. Women, the elderly, and the sick often had no choice but to suffer in silence or rely on others for help. For them, a midnight trip outside in the snow could be exhausting or even dangerous. So while you lie in bed tonight, warm and half asleep, try to imagine yourself layered in itchy wool, groping for a candle stub, then stepping out into the frozen night air. Your breath fogs in front of you. Your boots crunch through crusted snow. Somewhere, in the darkness, you hear a rat skitter, and all you wanted was to pee. That's medieval nighttime reality. No privacy, no plumbing, and no relief until you braved the cold. Silence, true silence, is a modern luxury. In the medieval world, especially during long winter nights, silence wasn't silent. It was filled with a chorus of unsettling, persistent, and at times terrifying sounds, each one a reminder that the darkness outside your cottage walls was alive and indifferent to your comfort. Let's begin with the most primal, wolves. Wolves were not yet extinct in much of medieval Europe. They roamed forests and hills, drawn closer to villages during the winter months, when prey was scarce. Their howls, long, low, and chilling, echoed across snow-covered fields, carrying through the cold air. In areas near woodlands, villagers knew that wolves might venture closer at night, skirting the edges of farms, sniffing around barns, even attacking livestock if desperate. For people already sleeping fitfully, the sound of a wolf's howl was not merely eerie. It was a threat, a symbol of danger, hunger, and death. Superstitions fed into this fear. Wolves were seen as demonic creatures in many medieval tales, embodiments of the wild, of sin, or even shape-shifting humans. Hearing them at night wasn't just a natural event, it was a spiritual omen. Then came the dogs, the village's first line of defense and its most persistent source of noise. Dogs were kept not as pets, but as guards, ratters, or herders. At night, they barked constantly. A rustle in the dark, a gust of wind, a fox in the henhouse, and a chain reaction would start. One bark turned into 3, then 5. Then the whole village seemed to erupt with canine alarm. Since many people slept in one-room homes with thin walls and open rafters, the barking sounded like it was right beside your head. And once the dogs got going, good luck falling back asleep. Human noises were no better. People snored, loudly and without shame. Coughing was constant. Winter brought with it colds, bronchitis, and worse, and in unventilated homes, filled with smoke and stale air, respiratory ailments were common. A night in a medieval cottage meant hearing your neighbor hack and wheeze across the room. With no tissues or modern remedies, people cleared their throats noisily, spat into corners, or groaned aloud from their straw beds. Infants cried, goats bleated, someone's stomach gurgled audibly after a meal of undercooked beans. In crowded homes, you didn't just hear the sounds, you felt them. The creaking of boards as someone rolled over, the hiss of someone whispering to a spouse, the clatter of a dropped chamber pot lid. But perhaps the most constant sound of all was the wind. Medieval homes were not airtight. Wind sliced through every gap in the thatched roof, whistling through cracks in the wattle and daub walls. If you were lucky, the thatch held. If not, a storm might peel it back, allowing gusts to blow snow or rain right onto your sleeping face. In some cottages, it wasn't unusual to wake up with a light dusting of snow on your blanket, or to hear the drip 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 of melting ice landing in a puddle by the hearth. This howling wind wasn't the romantic kind that makes you want to curl up by a fire with a book. It was relentless, cold, and full of menace. When the fire had gone out, the wind became the master of the house, slipping under doors, puffing through shutters, slamming them open with loud bangs. Every breeze became a breath of winter itself, crawling across your skin like an unwelcome spirit. And speaking of spirits, many sounds at night were attributed not to nature, but to the supernatural. A creaking rafter. Maybe it was the soul of a dead relative, come to give warning. An owl's screech. A sign that someone in the village would soon die. A scratching in the wall. Perhaps rats or perhaps something worse. In a world steeped in superstition, every unexplained sound at night was freighted with meaning. People didn't have the luxury of rational explanations. With no insulation, no light, and no privacy, the night was a sensory assault. And with no distractions, no podcasts, no white noise machines, no smartphones, your ears were always working, listening, interpreting, imagining. Even within monasteries, where strict silence was kept, the night brought sound, the toll of bells for nighttime prayers, the soft rustle of robes, as monks rose from bed to attend to vigils, the sound of chanting echoing down stone corridors. In castles, the groan of ancient wooden beams and the drip of condensation onto flagstones formed the nightly soundtrack. Even luxury did not silence the medieval night. And let's not forget vermin, the sound of rats in the rafters, skittering and gnawing, the crunch of straw beneath tiny feet, the squeak of mice nesting near the hearth. These weren't imagined sounds. They were real, persistent, and sometimes terrifying, when heard in the dark, while you lay motionless, hoping nothing would crawl across your face. Sleep, already segmented and fitful, was further fractured by this symphony of nighttime noise. People were used to it, but that didn't make it soothing. The night wasn't quiet. It was crowded, with voices, with animals, with wind and warning, and scratching. It pressed in from all sides. In a way, the medieval night was alive, not restful, but restless. It breathed through holes in your roof. It howled in the trees. It coughed through your neighbors. And all you could do was pull the blanket tighter and hope the noise passed with the hours. So while you lie in your quiet, climate-controlled room, be grateful. The sounds of our modern night, the hum of an appliance, the distant car, are lubbies compared to the raw, unfiltered chorus of a medieval winter evening. It's one thing to fall asleep in the cold. It's another thing entirely to fall asleep cold and hungry. And in the medieval winter, hunger wasn't a passing inconvenience, it was a steady companion. For many, especially peasants and the poor, the sound of your stomach growling in the dark was as familiar as the wind through the rafters. Medieval winters were, quite simply, a season of scarcity. The harvest was long over by the time December arrived. Whatever grains, vegetables, or salted meat a household had managed to store had to last until spring. There were no supermarkets, no last-minute trips to the store, no central food aid. If your family didn't grow it, preserve it, or trade for it, you didn't eat. Even well-managed food stores ran low by January or February. Root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips might last longer, but only if kept in cool, dry storage, and many homes didn't have proper cellars. Bread grew stale. Grains might be rationed by the handful. Meat, when available, was heavily salted, dried, or smoked, and by winter's peak, you'd be lucky to get even a scrap. This meant going to bed hungry wasn't rare. It was a grim routine. Children cried themselves to sleep, clutching empty bellies. Adults lay awake, stomachs churning with acid and disappointment. Hunger in the Middle Ages wasn't always dramatic. It was slow, constant, and wearing. And it didn't leave your dreams alone, either. People dreamed of food, literally. Nightmares weren't always about monsters or spirits. Sometimes, they were about kitchens, about loaves of bread just out of reach, about hot pottage steaming in bowls you couldn't taste, about golden roast chickens or fresh apples. The hunger followed you into your subconscious. It shaped your thoughts, your sleep, and your very sense of time. There are even accounts in medieval writings of people dreaming of feast while starving, only to wake with a deeper despair. For some, the memory of a meal was worse than the absence of one. It reminded you of what you couldn't have, of what your stomach remembered but your larder could not provide. Even when food was available, it was rarely satisfying. A peasant's winter supper might be nothing more than a bowl of thin pottage, a watery mix of grain boiled with whatever scraps could be found. No salt, no spices, just warmth and bulk. If there was bread, it might be black and dense, made from rye or barley mixed with ground peas, acorns, or even sawdust. In desperate times, some people went to bed early on purpose, not from tiredness, but to avoid the ache of hunger. Lying still in the dark was, ironically, a way to conserve energy. Moving around meant burning calories you couldn't afford to lose. So families curled up in their bedding, not to rest, but to wait, for the sun to rise, for spring to come, for the stomach to give up complaining. Hunger also brought with it a kind of irritability. People snapped more in winter. They argued. They brooded. In small cottages where multiple generations might share a single sleeping space, tempers flared. A stolen crust, an extra ladle of gruel. These could start feuds. Hunger made everyone more sensitive and more suspicious. And then there were the weak and the old. For them, winter hunger was often fatal. With no strength to fight infection and no nutrition to heal, many simply wasted away. Children, too, were especially vulnerable. Malnourished from birth, they didn't always make it through a harsh winter. Some mothers went without food themselves to feed their children, a noble but dangerous sacrifice. Others had nothing to offer at all. We often think of fasting today as a health trend. In the medieval world, it wasn't a choice. It was daily reality. And religious fasting made things even worse. During Lent or Advent, or on saints' days, the church demanded people abstain from meat and certain fats, even in the dead of winter. For the poor, already eating little, these fasts were both absurd and unavoidable. Breaking them could mean punishment. Observing them could mean further weakness. What made it all worse was the knowledge that someone, somewhere, had plenty. In castles and monasteries, the wealthy and powerful dined better, even in winter. They had access to preserved meats, imported spices, and larger storerooms. Their kitchens bustled with activity, even while nearby villagers sucked on boiled roots and gnawed stale crusts. The smells from these manors often drifted into peasant homes, a cruel reminder of the divide. Some monasteries did provide alms, leftover food given to the needy, but it wasn't regular or reliable, and it certainly wasn't enough to go around. Begging became more common in winter, even though travel was dangerous and roads were icy and long. Many simply stayed where they were, hungry and still, waiting for the thaw. And so, the medieval night, already freezing, crowded, and infested, when you lie in a warm bed with another layer of misery. Consider how different your dreams might be if you've gone to sleep like a medieval peasant when your stomach twists itself into knots. Dreaming of boiled turnips still when every creak of the roof. Darkness wasn't just an inconvenience in the medieval world. That morning it was a threat, and with it not much more food. People lacked electric turnips and onions, or that travel was harder. They were tragic. It was that they truly believed the night belonged to something else, something beyond human, that it couldn't have. When morning came, the hunger didn't fade. It just grew quieter. People rose was considered the time when the boundary between the living or drank hot water with a pinch of herbs. To sleep during a medieval winter night meant more than just huddling against the cold or shooing away rats. All with little fuel in their realm of fear. A spiritual, unseen fear, the kind you couldn't lock out, because it didn't walk onto legs. It whispered through the rafters. It crouched in the corners of your cottage. It waited until the fire died down, and all the prayers had been said. The medieval imagination was crowded with creatures of the night. Demons, first and foremost, were real to the medieval mind, not metaphorical evils, but active beings that roamed the world after dark. These weren't cartoonish red imps with pitchforks, but malevolent spirits capable of tormenting the soul, possessing the body, or worse, preying on the sleeping. A sudden illness in the night, a child who stopped breathing in their crib, a strange dream that left you paralyzed. All could be explained by demonic visitation, and the fear of them was not limited to theologians or monks. It was everywhere. Common people kept charms by their bedsides, carved crosses, dried herbs, pieces of iron, all believed to ward off the influence of these spirits. Stories circulated about people who had heard whispering in the dark, who had seen glowing eyes beyond the window, or who woke with bruises from invisible hands. If demons were not enough, there were ghosts, restless spirits of the dead who wandered by night, especially in the colder months, when the nights grew longer and the veil between worlds was said to thin. Ghosts weren't always evil, but they were always unsettling. The belief was that souls, who had died violently, or without proper burial, or who had unresolved sins, might appear to the living, usually at night, often at the foot of the bed. Some ghosts came to deliver messages. Others simply haunted the spaces they had once lived in. In a culture with very few means of comforting the grieving, and where death was constant, ghost stories became a way to process loss and anxiety. And yet, they also fed the fear. Every creak in the beams, every gust of wind through the shutters, could be a soul come to visit. And then came witches. While the major witch hunts of the early modern period had not yet reached their fever pitch in the early medieval centuries, belief in witches, usually old women who had made pacts with the devil, was widespread. Witches, it was thought, flew at night, transformed into animals, cast spells that caused crops to fail or cows to stop giving milk, and danced with demons in the forests. The night was their territory. Winter nights, in particular, were thought to be full of witchcraft, when the cold helped preserve the silence and secrecy needed for their sabbats. Tales circulated of people waking in the dark, feeling unable to move, pressed down by an unseen force, a condition we now know as sleep paralysis, but which then was seen as proof of witchly interference. People took precautions. Salt was sprinkled at the thresholds. Bells were hung on doors. Certain herbs, especially St. John's wort, vervain, or garlic, were placed near the bed. Crucifixes were carved into wood beams. And perhaps most famously, church bells were rung at evening and before dawn, not just to mark the hours, but to drive back the darkness. The peal of a church bell in the dead of night was not casual, it was protective. It was believed to push back the influence of spirits and to remind both the living and the dead that the church still stood watch. Some villages even rang bells during storms or plagues, fearing that evil spirits might use such moments to slip through unnoticed. It's worth remembering that in this deeply religious world, the night wasn't just feared, it was the domain of the devil. Daytime belonged to God, but when the sun set, the divine light went with it, and the dark took over. In monasteries, monks rose at midnight for nocturnes, not just to pray, but to protect their souls during the darkest hour. when temptation and evil were thought to be strongest. Children were especially warned. Nightmares were blamed on demons. Wandering outside after sunset was forbidden. It wasn't just that you might fall or freeze, you might be taken. Children were told tales of creatures like the Naxur, the corpse that rose to eat its kin, or the wild hunt, a spectral group of ghostly horsemen said to sweep up souls during the dark months. Even simple shadows could be interpreted as omens. And while today we dismiss many of these fears as superstitions, in the medieval mind, they were explanations. In a world without science, electricity, or medicine, the unknown had to be filled in somehow. And what filled it was a tapestry of demons, witches, and spirits that made the cold, creaking dark even colder. So imagine lying in your straw bed, wrapped in patched wool, listening to the wind moan through the shutters. The fire has long since died. Your neighbor across the room is whispering a prayer. A dog barks in the distance. And you hear something? A knock, a breath, a scrape on the wall. You shut your eyes. You mutter a charm. You clutch the wooden cross hung from a nail near your bed. You hope that when you wake, the sun will be back, and whatever was moving in the dark will have returned to wherever it came from. The medieval winter night wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a battleground of the soul, between faith and fear, between the living and the dead, between light and the long dark. Modern nights are filled with noise, the hum of electricity, the blue glow of screens, the soft buzz of podcasts, audiobooks, late-night television, scrolling apps. But imagine, for a moment, a night where none of it exists. No light bulbs, no phones, no books, no music, no Netflix. Just you, the dark, and time that refuses to move. That was the reality of most medieval winter nights. When the sun set, and in winter, it set early, there was nothing to do. You couldn't read unless you were among the extremely rare literate few, and even then, you wouldn't have had anything to read. Books were hand-copied, scarce, and expensive. A single illuminated manuscript might cost as much as a small farm. They were kept in monasteries or churches, not in cottages. The average peasant didn't even own a scrap of parchment, let alone a novel to curl up with. And even if by some miracle you had a book, how would you read it? Candles were precious. Oil lamps were expensive and smoky. Most people relied on the fear light, and once the fire was out, so was your vision. The darkness wasn't gentle or cozy. It was absolute. When the hearth's glow faded to embers, there was no ambient light, no moonbeams pouring through glass windows, because glass was rare. Most windows were simple wooden shutters or holes stuffed with cloth. So what did people do? They waited, they sat, they lay still and listened to the wind, and the coughing and the creaking. Maybe they whispered prayers. Maybe they muttered to themselves. Maybe they stared into the dark and hoped morning would come faster than the last night. In wealthier households, there might have been storytelling, but even this was limited by time, fuel, and fatigue. A grandmother might share a folk tale while everyone huddled near the hearth. But once the firewood ran out, or someone had to step outside to relieve themselves in the snow, the night lost its charm fast. Games. Board games existed, sure, like Nine Men's Morris or dice, but peasants rarely had time or energy for leisure in the dead of winter. And even if they had the materials, no one wanted to play by candlelight that could barely illuminate the table. Wood and wax were for survival, not amusement. Music. Unless someone in the house played a bone flute, or a crude string instrument, and unless they had the strength to perform after a day of freezing labor, music was reserved for feast days or taverns, not for the dead silence of Tuesday night in mid-January. In some cases, people simply went to bed right after supper, not because they were tired, but because there was nothing else to do. Why sit upright in the freezing dark, when lying down at least meant some shared body heat? Entire families might crawl under a pile of blankets, fully clothed, to wait for sleep, not to enjoy it, but to pass the time. But even in bed, the night dragged on. There were no clocks, no way to know how many hours remained, just an instinctual sense that the fire was dead, the air was colder, and your toes had lost all feeling. Time stretched. Minutes became hours. It was the opposite of the modern rush. Nothing happened, and it happened forever. Some nights, people practiced segmented sleep, a concept we've already covered, waking in the middle of the night to sit quietly or pray. But what they didn't do was entertain themselves. There was no midnight snack, no late-night comedy special, no book of riddles to page through while the dog snarled, just the void. And we can't overstate how deeply psychological this emptiness was. Boredom, for us, is a passing state. For medieval people, it was a condition of life. But winter nights made it worse. The dark seemed never-ending. The silence was oppressive. The lack of stimulation made every second feel heavier. Your mind wandered. You might dwell on guilt, fear, hunger, death, or just on how slowly the cold crept up your spine. Sometimes people said prayers, not because they were devout, but because prayers gave your brain something to do. Repeating the same words, over and over, filled the silence. It was something to cling to. Like a mental fire in a frozen room, a small rhythm in a night with none. The church helped a little. Monks, for instance, followed the liturgical hours, waking in the middle of the night for vigils and psalms. These rituals gave their nights structure, but even in a monastery, most of the night was spent in cold stone dormitories, cloaked in silence and darkness, with little comfort beyond faith and habit. The wealthy were better off. They might have books, servants to stoke the fire, or even entertainment in the form of poetry and music. But most people weren't rich. Most lived in small, cramped cottages with no parchment, no song, and no escape from the dark. So the medieval winter night wasn't just physically cold, it was mentally hollow. Imagine staring at the wall for hours with nothing to see, nothing to hear, no stimulation, just the slow tick of your heartbeat, and the occasional crack of frozen wood shifting under stress. That was what passed for normal. And over time, it shaped people. It shaped their sense of time, their sense of spirituality, their idea of what night meant. For us, night is when the fun starts. For them, it was a slow march through the void, a darkness filled with fear, silence, and waiting. The closest modern equivalent may be camping, but even camping has flashlights, phones, books, and snacks. The medieval night had none of these. It just had dark. So if you ever lie in bed, frustrated that your phone battery is low, or that your streaming service is buffering, or that your book fell behind the bed, take a moment, turn everything off, lie still, look at nothing, listen to nothing, and just wait. That's the closest you'll get to understanding what a medieval winter night felt like. If you've ever had a fever that seemed worse at night, you're not alone. And you're not imagining things. The medieval world noticed it too, but while we now have medical science to help us understand and manage nighttime illness, people in the Middle Ages had neither the knowledge nor the tools. All they had was the experience. Sickness always felt worse in the night, and in winter, that's when sickness thrived. Let's begin with the obvious. There was no central heating. Once the fire went out, and it often did, your home plunged into the kind of cold that didn't just make you uncomfortable, it invited illness in. The dampness in the air, the condensation in thatch, the chill of stone walls, the unrelenting drafts, these created a perfect storm for colds, fevers, and respiratory infections. People slept fully clothed not just for warmth, but to protect against the night air, which was thought to carry illness. And while night air was a superstition, it wasn't entirely off base. In rooms with poor ventilation, thick with smoke from indoor fires, and packed with people and animals, the air quality was abysmal. These were spaces where bacteria and viruses could linger and spread easily, especially in winter when windows were sealed, and no one wanted to let in the icy wind. The body's immune system also behaves differently overnight. Fevers often spike at night, due to natural circadian rhythms and the body's inflammation processes. For someone in the Middle Ages, with no thermometer, no medication, and no explanation, this meant that the shivering got worse after sundown, the sweating intensified, the coughing became unbearable, and your family just had to watch you suffer in the dark, hoping you'd still be breathing by morning. No painkillers, no antibiotics, no understanding of germs. Only old wives' remedies and whatever prayers you could whisper between shivers. You might be given a tea made from nettle or elderflower, or have warm cloths pressed to your head, or garlic tied to your wrists. Some thought fevers were caused by evil spirits, and the truly desperate might call for a priest before a physician. Confession was as important as any medicine. just in case the illness turned fatal. And yet, physicians, if they could be afforded, often did more harm than good. One of the main treatments for fever was bloodletting, based on the belief that sickness came from imbalanced humors. So if you were burning up at midnight, someone might open a vein by candlelight to let the bad humor flow out. This often made things worse. Infection, weakness, and further exposure to the cold were common outcomes. The homes themselves were breeding grounds for illness. Families often shared a single room for sleeping, cooking, and sheltering animals. That's right, goats, chickens, pigs, all in the same space. Animals produced body heat, yes, but also dander, filth, and disease. A cough from one child could become a household-wide illness within days. And when one person got sick in winter, the illness usually didn't leave until spring. No fresh air, no fruits, no vitamins. The diet in winter was heavy on preserved foods, salted meats, hard bread, dried peas. Scurvy, rickets, and general malnutrition weakened the body further, making every cold more dangerous. Winter fever was sometimes code for the beginning of the end, and people knew it. That's what made sickness in winter so terrifying. Summer fevers could pass, but winter fevers, those were the bad ones. If your skin turned pale, and your forehead burned, and the fire had already died down, it was time to start praying. There were no thermometers, no oxygen monitors, no cozy blankets fresh from the dryer, just a mound of wool, a coughing fit, and the heavy silence of the room. People sometimes stayed awake at night to watch over the sick, taking shifts to keep the fire going or sponge sweat from a brow. But without light, it was a miserable vigil. You could barely see the person you were caring for. If they died, it might not be noticed until morning. More than one medieval mother woke up beside a lifeless child, who had passed quietly in the dark. There were also fears, deeply rooted fears, that illness could attract evil. A person with fever might hallucinate, mutter strange things, or twitch in their sleep. This was sometimes interpreted as demonic influence. Some believed illness made the soul vulnerable to spirits. So being sick at night wasn't just a physical ordeal, it was a spiritual danger. The wrong word in your delirium could scare your family as much as your cough. And then there was the sound of illness in the night. In a small village, with thin walls and shared spaces, everyone heard when someone was sick. The hacking coughs, the crying, the retching, the whispers of, "He's getting worse." The rumors would spread before dawn. By morning, someone might already be digging a grave. Of course, not all illness was deadly. Some people survived the night. Some people got better, but they did so despite the conditions, not because of them. And those long nights of fever, wrapped in stiff blankets soaked in sweat, were often seared into memory. Children who survived often remembered how close death had come, the blackness, the delirium, the cold sweat. Elders whispered about how they'd once beat the winter lung fever, or the great chill, but many others didn't live to tell the tale. It's no surprise that some winter prayers included pleas for health, that people carved protective charms into their door frames, that they drank foul herbal brews, just in case, because everyone knew sickness loves the night, and winter was its season. Today, we take for granted how manageable a fever can be. A few pills, some hot soup, an extra blanket. But for medieval people, a nighttime cough in December was a warning, a turning point, an event. And if it came with a chill, and a whisper of sweat in the hairline, well, you just had to hope you'd live to see the sun. The medieval day ended early, and the night dragged on forever. But it wasn't just the cold or the darkness that made it feel endless, it was the silence. And in that silence, something else came creeping in, your thoughts. When the fire went out and the chores were done, and there was nothing left to see or do, or hear, people were left alone with their own minds. And in the Middle Ages, that was not a comforting place to be, because in a world governed by religion, fear, and constant hardship, the night hours often became a time of prayer, regret, and quiet talking. Not talking to others, talking to yourself, or to God, or to whatever might be listening in the dark. You couldn't read. You couldn't knit or sew in the dark. You couldn't go for a walk or light a candle just for the sake of thinking. So instead, people lay in their beds and whispered prayers, for warmth, for health, for forgiveness, for protection from demons. The night was a time when the soul felt most vulnerable, and medieval people knew it. They believed sin could creep in with the shadows, That temptation came when you were most tired and cold. That the devil prowled in the dark looking for souls to claim. So people spoke quietly, hushed, Our Fathers, and Hail Marys, or old local blessings and charms. Some repeated the same phrases, like mantras, over and over. A woman might murmur protection over her children. A man might confess silently, again and again, afraid that he hadn't done enough to cleanse his sins before sleep. And many people, especially the old and the sick, whispered regrets. There were no therapists, no journals, no letters to write in candlelight. If you had guilt, it lived in your head. If you had sorrow, it lived in your chest. And the quiet of the night, that deep, hollow quiet of a medieval winter, pulled it out of you. You remembered who you'd lost, what you'd done, what you hadn't done, the fight you never made right, the apology you never gave, the moment you let pass. People muttered to themselves, not in madness, but in mourning, in reflection, in anxiety. They told the darkness what they couldn't tell the daylight. I'm sorry. I should have gone. I miss you. Why did he die? Why was I spared? If a neighbor heard them, they wouldn't think them strange, because everyone talked to the dark eventually, and the darkness listened. It absorbed everything, the whispered prayers, the sighs, the sniffles, the softly spoken names of the dead. It was a companion and a confessor. The night took in your secrets, because there was no one else to tell them to. Monks formalized this in their night prayers, matins and lauds, scheduled in the darkest hours of the night. They would rise from sleep, file into stone chapels by candlelight, and chant psalms to keep the dark at bay. It was discipline, yes, but also survival, structure to hold back the silence, words to fill the void. But for the average person, a peasant in a drafty cottage, the only tools were memory and mumbling. People spoke to dead relatives. They asked for signs. They hoped for dreams. Some even believed that dreams themselves were messages, from saints, from angels, from the departed. So the night became not just a time of rest, but of spiritual negotiation. Please forgive me. Please watch over her. Please. Just let us make it to spring. And what did they hear in response? Nothing. Just wind rattling the shutters. Maybe the squeak of a rat, the shifting of the roof, the creak of someone else turning in bed. But that silence was enough to keep people talking, because it wasn't really silence. It was the world waiting, listening. Many also used the dark hours to prepare for death, not because they expected it, but because it always felt close. A fever might return. The baby might stop breathing. The wolves might come down from the hills. Or the cold might simply be too much. So people prayed not just for protection, but for a good death. A death with time to confess. A death with loved ones nearby. A death with dignity. Because in medieval Europe, that was considered almost as important as life itself. Dying in your sleep, unshriven, with no last rites. That was terrifying. That meant a soul in peril. And so people whispered their confessions into the dark, just in case. Maybe not complete ones. Maybe not loud enough for others to hear. But God would hear, they believed. Or the saints would. Or someone. Someone had to be listening. For those who suffered from depression, not that the term existed, or deep sadness, the winter night was especially brutal. The long months of hunger, the pressure to survive, the losses from plague, or childbirth or war, it all came out in the stillness of night. There was no distraction, no comfort, just you, and your breath, and the things you couldn't change. Many wept softly, others stayed silent, eyes open, watching the shadows crawl along the beams. There was no shame in it. There was nothing else to do. And sometimes, in moments of strange clarity, people even found peace in that darkness, because when all the tools of the day were gone, the tools of work, of worry, of performance, all that was left was honesty. The kind of honesty that only happens when no one's watching, when the house is still, when your body is too tired to lie to itself. It wasn't comfortable, but it was real. So yes, medieval winter nights were horrible, but not just for the lice, or the cold, or the lack of toilets. They were horrible because they gave you nowhere to hide from your own mind. And when the only sound was the wind outside, and your own whisper inside, you learned to talk, to pray, to confess, to grieve, to wait, to ask questions that might never be answered. It was silence that demanded speech, darkness that drew out the soul. And when the rooster finally crowed, and the frost broke underfoot, and the sun's pale light began to push through the cracks, people rose not just tired, but emptied, not just frozen, but relieved. because the long night was over, and the dark for now had kept your secrets. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from work, but from waiting, a slow, dull weariness from doing absolutely nothing except lying still, curled up in cold darkness, hoping for something to change. In the medieval winter night, this waiting could feel endless, but eventually, dawn did come, or at least, the idea of dawn, a faint shift in the air, a softening of the blackness outside, a subtle glow pushing against the cracks in the wooden shutters. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. No birds burst into song. No golden rays swept across the floor. It was more like the night leaked away, inch by inch, as though even the sun itself was reluctant to get up. Inside the cottage, no one leapt from bed. There were no alarms, no chirping phones, no perky coffee commercials, just the slow stirring of limbs, and her heavy, lice-ridden blankets. A cough, a sniff, the scrape of a foot against the straw mattress, the quiet acknowledgement, we made it through another one. Before anyone even said a word, someone would need to get up, usually the mother or oldest child. They'd grope their way through the gloom to find the ashes of the hearth, now cold and gray. With luck, a coal might still be glowing faintly, buried in the embers. If so, it could be coaxed back to life with dry kindling and breath. If not, if the fire had died completely, they'd need to start from scratch. Flint and steel, sparks onto char cloth or dry moss, fingers stiff with cold, breath fogging in the air, and all around them, the house remained half asleep. The animals snorted softly, the children groaned and turned over. Someone mumbled a morning prayer, but no one fully rose until that fire came back, because the fire wasn't just heat, it was hope, light, food, protection, the heart of the home. Once the flames returned, so did the color. Flickering orange glinted off clay pots and soot-streaked beams. Shadows jumped across walls. Life, in a small way, resumed. Someone would fetch water, often from a frozen bucket or outside stream. Someone would break off a hunk of stale bread, or scoop the last of the porridge from a pot left near the coals. The first meal was quiet, slow, half-hearted. It wasn't breakfast in the modern sense. It was just fuel, something to fill the emptiness before labor began again. But the cold never left. Even with a fresh fire, the chill seeped in from every crack. Feet stayed numb, noses dripped, breath hung in the air like mist. Outside, the frost still crusted every surface, and overhead, the sun barely managed more than a weak glow. It gave light, yes, but not warmth. Still, light was enough. After a night of total blackness, even gray skies and pale sunshine felt like a gift. It meant the rhythm of life could continue. Animals needed feeding, tools needed mending, firewood needed gathering. The business of surviving another day began again. But the knowledge lingered. This would all happen again. In just a few hours, the sun would sink, the light would fade, the fire would flicker low, and the same long, cold night would return. The same darkness, the same fears, the same whispering into the void. For people in the Middle Ages, winter was not a single event, it was a cycle, a pattern, a test of endurance repeated every evening for months, and each night was a reminder of how fragile everything was. Light had to be earned, warmth had to be fought for, and the mind, left alone in the dark, could turn on you. There were no holidays to break up the monotony once Christmas passed, no TV specials, no snow days, no cheerful playlists, just more cold, more dark, more waiting, and yet they endured. Because what else could they do? Winter didn't ask for permission. It simply arrived, and made itself comfortable. And people did what they always did. They wrapped themselves in wool, they muttered old prayers, they listened to the wind, and they waited. Waited for warmth, waited for spring, waited for morning, waited for light, because no matter how dark the night became, they believed the sun would return, eventually, somehow. And so, every morning, cold, pale, and heavy-eyed, they began again, tending the fire, tending the animals, tending to each other, carrying the weight of another sleepless night into another freezing day, all the while knowing, tonight, the darkness returns, but also, so will I. It begins with the basic threat of the cold, a constant presence that defined every waking and sleeping moment. Firewood was hard to come by. Fires died out quickly. Most homes lacked chimneys, meaning any smoke-producing warmth was suffocating and temporary. Once the fire went out, the room froze, and relighting it in the middle of the night was often impossible. The cold wasn't just a nuisance, it was dangerous. From there, the script explores the physical discomforts of bedtime. People didn't change into sleepwear, they simply slept in their worn, lice-infested daytime clothes. Straw mattresses were filled with insects and filth. Nights were a hotbed of itching, shivering, and trying to get comfortable with a bunch of other people, and sometimes livestock, all crammed into the same sleeping space. But sleep itself wasn't simple. The phenomenon of segmented sleep meant people often woke up around midnight and stayed awake for hours, sitting in the dark, whispering to themselves, or their God, and just waiting for the second round of sleep to arrive. With no books, no light, and no real comfort, the night became a time of anxious introspection and whispered regrets. Hygiene brought its own challenges. Bathroom needs required either a freezing trip outdoors, or the use of a chamber pot, if one was lucky enough to have one. For most people, relieving themselves at night meant stepping into snow, ice, and pitch-black silence, often barefoot. Night sounds played a major role in the discomfort. Wolves howling, dogs barking, sick people coughing, wind whistling through gaps in the thatch. It all combined into an eerie soundtrack that reminded everyone how vulnerable they were. These sounds were both real and imagined. Superstition filled the dark with ghosts, demons, and witches, leading to the ringing of church bells, and the saying of prayers to keep evil at bay. Hunger added to the misery. Winter meant limited food supplies, and people often went to bed with empty stomachs, dreaming of turnips, dried peas, or nothing at all. Sleep was often interrupted by pangs of hunger, and some nights, it was impossible to rest at all. And then there was sickness, winter's constant companion. Illnesses like colds, flus, and fevers always seemed worse at night. Without heat, proper nutrition, or fresh air, homes were breeding grounds for disease. Fevered people shivered and hallucinated while family members watched helplessly in the dark, hoping they'd make it to dawn. Emotionally and spiritually, the night was a vulnerable time. People whispered prayers and confessions, not because they were pious, though many were, but because the darkness forced them inward. Regrets surfaced, sins were recalled. People talked to God, the dead, or simply to themselves, because the dark offered no distractions. The only thing that brought relief was the slow, uncertain return of light. The last section paints a quiet, melancholy picture of dawn, someone slowly rekindling the fire, others stirring under coarse blankets, the cold still biting, but at least visible now, instead of swallowing everything in blackness. And yet, even with the light returning, everyone knew the cycle would repeat. The sun's appearance wasn't a victory, just a reprieve. Tone and purpose. Throughout the script, the tone remains intentionally slow, quiet, and almost hypnotic, perfect for sleep storytelling. It's not trying to scare or sensationalize, but instead to lull the viewer into sleep with detailed discomfort. Every section builds a mood of creeping cold, existential stillness, and emotional fatigue, not just to educate, but to soothe the modern listener with the strange comfort of, at least it's not that bad anymore. It's not a history of battles or royalty. It's a history of ordinary people enduring the long night, over and over, with nothing but threadbare wool and a whispered prayer.